Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most massive and honestly most consequential geopolitical shifts of the entire 20th century. We're looking at the dramatic transformation that completely swept across Asia right after World War II, culminating in the monumental events of 1949. The world order had literally just been rewritten by the defeat of the Axis powers, but over in East Asia, the end of one devastating global war simply lit the fuse for another massive conflict.
Who lost China? It sounds like a simple four-word question, right? But I really want you to appreciate just how much absolute panic it induced back in 1949. This single question totally dominated American domestic politics for years. It shattered Washington's cozy assumptions about post-war Asia, and it heavily fueled the bitter Red Scare and the rise of McCarthyism, which, by the way, ultimately purged the State Department's so-called China hands. It fundamentally redefined the entire Cold War. But to really grasp why this question was just so explosive, we have to look at how the sky-high superpower expectations of the era violently collided with the actual reality on the ground.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with a fragile post-war peace, then move into the Civil War resumes, the communist victory, leaning to one side, and finally, crossing the Yalu River.
Section 1. A fragile post-war peace, the superpower illusion of 1945.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the extreme irony of the situation in 1945. U.S. President Harry Truman and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin actually wanted the exact same outcome in China. Seriously, they both wanted to avoid a large-scale Chinese civil war at all costs, and they both officially supported the nationalist government, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek. The U.S. figured a unified pro-American China under Chiang would effectively contain Soviet expansion. Stalin, on the flip side, really doubted the Chinese Communist Party's strength. He prioritized a pragmatic deal with Chiang just to protect Soviet strategic interests, like vital ports and railways in Manchuria. So basically, both global superpowers were trying to mandate a peaceful coalition from the top down.
But wow, did this high-level superpower maneuvering completely clash with the volatile boots-on-the-ground reality. Years of brutal Japanese occupation had absolutely devastated the nationalist armies and the local economy. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, under Mao Zedong, hadn't just been sitting around. They used that time to massively expand their rural base areas, building deep, foundational popular support through strict, disciplined organization and sweeping land reform. So when the U.S. sent General George Marshall to try and broker a peace coalition between 1945 and 1946, it was virtually an impossible task. Even as they sat smiling at the negotiating table, both the CCP and the nationalists were secretly and very aggressively preparing for an inevitable full-scale war.
Part 2. The Civil War resumes. Manchuria ignites.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what happened next. When the Japanese surrendered, a frantic, high-stakes race kicked off in the geographic powder keg of Manchuria. Both nationalist and CCP forces scrambled to claim this highly industrialized territory, not to mention the massive stockpiles of Japanese weapons left behind. At first, Soviet troops who had occupied Manchuria in the final days of World War II kind of obstructed the nationalist forces. But then, when the Soviet army began a rapid withdrawal in early 1946, it created this massive, gaping power vacuum. And that sudden geographic and military scramble, that's what literally ignited the full-scale civil war.
Far away from those neat, tidy, diplomatic negotiations in Washington and Moscow, the everyday reality for citizens was just pure chaos. Take a look at this tragic 1948 Shanghai bank run. You have regular people desperately trying to exchange their rapidly depreciating paper money for gold. It was so frantic that 10 people were actually crushed to death in the melee. It's heartbreaking, but it shows us exactly why the nationalist government lost its grip. Rampant corruption, total demoralization, and crippling hyperinflation literally destroyed their public support from the inside out, way before the final shots were even fired.
Section 3. The Communist Victory. The Rapid Fall of the KMT. Let's move on and see how this builds.
Because the sheer speed of the nationalist collapse genuinely shocked the world. It was like a row of cascading dominoes. In the fall of 1948, the massive Liaoshen campaign secured all of Manchuria for the communists. Right on its heels, during the winter of 1948 into 1949, the Huaihai campaign absolutely decimated Chiang Kai-shek's best central armies. The People's Liberation Army swept in and captured Beijing largely without a fight in January, and they had crossed the Yangtze River by April. And as they pushed forward, the CCP simply absorbed hundreds of thousands of surrendering nationalist troops along with massive amounts of U.S.-supplied equipment. Finally, on October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood at Tiananmen Gate and officially proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China.
475 million. That was Mao's own estimate of China's population at the time. I really want you to let that number sink in for a second. This represents the monumental human and geopolitical stakes we are talking about here. Almost overnight, a fifth of humanity had suddenly shifted over to a Marxist-Leninist regime. The nationalist remnant state was forced to retreat to the island of Taiwan, and the entire global balance of power was permanently altered. It was a true game changer.
Part 4. Leaning to one side. The ideological pivot. On June 30, 1949, Mao Zedong published a piece containing a very famous phrase, leaning to one side. Now, this wasn't just some catchy political slogan. It was a rock-solid, definitive foreign policy declaration. See, for months, the U.S. had vaguely hoped they could somehow avoid dealing with a monolithic communist bloc. They thought, hey, maybe we can treat Mao a bit like Tito in Yugoslavia, keep him somewhat independent. But this quote completely crushed any American hopes of accommodation. Mao was publicly and very firmly aligning the new People's Republic of China with the Soviet camp. He made it crystal clear that managing relations with the USSR was his absolute top priority.
This ideological pivot was officially formalized in February 1950 with the Sino-Soviet Treaty. But getting this treaty, it was not easy. Mao actually traveled to Moscow in December 1949 and engaged in these grueling, intense negotiations with Stalin. Mao absolutely insisted on abolishing the old unequal treaties from 1945 that Stalin had previously signed with the nationalists. And after weeks of Stalin dodging and prevaricating, Mao just stood firm. He held his ground and eventually secured major revisions, a mutual defense alliance, and, crucially, vital Soviet economic and military aid for the new China.
Back in Washington, officials went into full panic mode over what became known as the domino view of Cold War Asia. With the massive landmass of China now officially allied with the Soviet Union, the U.S. was terrified that the rest of Asia, places like Indochina, Malaya, and Korea, would just fall to communism one by one. The U.S. State Department scrambled and issued a China white paper defending their policies, basically arguing that the outcome was totally beyond U.S. control. But, the political damage was already done. The U.S. rapidly hardened its containment strategy across all of Asia, straight up refusing to recognize Beijing and setting the stage for decades of future interventions.
Section 5. Crossing the Yalu River. The escalation climax.
To really understand why China eventually entered the Korean War, we have to look closely at Mao's strategic calculations. The new leadership felt entirely boxed in and encircled by the U.S. military presence. When the Korean War broke out in June 1950, the U.S. didn't just send troops to Korea, Truman also ordered a naval blockade of the Taiwan Strait. For the CCP, this blockade thwarted their ultimate goal of national reunification. Then a few months later, as U.S. and UN forces pushed North Korean troops back, they crossed the 38th parallel and marched right toward the Yalu River. To Beijing, this wasn't just a distant Korean issue anymore. It was a direct, glaring military threat right on China's industrial border in Manchuria.
So the crucial point is understanding this tense, incredibly high-stakes sequence in October 1950. First, the U.S. crossed the 38th parallel, totally ignoring Beijing's explicit warnings. Then, Stalin promised military aid to China, but he threw a massive curveball. He explicitly stated he couldn't provide immediate air cover over Korea. Despite this huge disadvantage, Mao made an incredibly bold, risky decision to intervene anyway. He feared having U.S. troops stationed right on his border, more than he feared the war itself. Finally, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops secretly crossed the Yalu River, dragging the newly founded PRC into a direct, bloody conflict with the United States.
I want to leave you with a really provocative historical debate today. Was the so-called loss of China actually an American foreign policy failure, or was it simply the inevitable result of an unstoppable internal revolution? Most historians today lean heavily toward the latter, emphasizing that nationalist weakness, CCP discipline, and decades of internal Chinese dynamics drove this outcome far more than anything Washington did or didn't do. I mean, the United States couldn't really lose a country it never owned in the first place, right? Yet that illusion, that superpowers can easily dictate the fates of massive nations, is an incredibly persistent one. I invite you to keep this question in mind as you look closer at the historical forces that continue to shape our modern world. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.